2025 was an insane year for tornadoes. Previously on this channel, I covered the first major tornado outbreak of 2025, the Pi Day Outbreak. 60 tornadoes touched down that day, with the vast majority of them causing significant damage. The next day, March 15th, was also a significant tornado day, with multiple strong to violent tornadoes touching down across Dixie Alley. In April, there were multiple significant outbreaks, including an outbreak sequence from April 2nd through the 7th, that produced 157 tornadoes, the most out of an outbreak in 2025. Going into May, there were many questions as to what the month could bring, and it wouldn't take long before Mother Nature would play her hand. And sadly, it would be most well known for its impacts on human life. On May 16th, 2025, multiple strong to violent tornadoes tore across Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky. Of those was an EF3 that tore through St. Louis, Missouri, an EF3 near Sikeston, Missouri, an EF4 near Marion, Illinois, an EF3 near Morganfield, Kentucky, and an EF4 that tore through London and Somerset, Kentucky. By the night's end, 26 would die, making May 16th the deadliest day for tornadoes of 2025. It'll be 1 year since the outbreak this month, and I feel like it's worth taking a look at the event. So today, I'll be taking a deep dive into the May 16th, 2025 tornado outbreak. I'll be covering the synopsis, the events as they occurred, the aftermath and response, the controversies following the tornadoes, and how the hardest hit areas are doing today. Welcome to Nature's Fury. The tornado outbreak I'll be discussing today technically includes tornadoes from the day prior, May 15th. For the sake of time, I will only be focusing on the tornadoes from May 16th, 2025. And if I sound weird in this video, I'm just getting over getting sick, so keep that in mind. In the mid-levels of the atmosphere, a negatively tilted trough was moving through the upper Midwest and mid-Mississippi Valley. Closer to the surface, an area of low pressure would move into the western Great Lakes as a cold front advanced to the east, with a very moist air mass remaining in place ahead of the front. The expectations for the event went as follows. Throughout the day, an area of low-level convergence was expected to become increasingly focused from the Ozarks into the mid-Mississippi Valley, resulting in the initiation of scattered strong to severe storms by midday. Instability would increase throughout the day, with mixed layer Cape peaking from 3,000 to 4,000 joules per kilogram from parts of the Ozarks eastward into the Ohio and Tennessee valleys. As instability increased, so too would deep layer shear and lift, as a mid-level jet approached from the west. And ahead of that feature was an 850 millibar jet that was expected to develop over the mid-Mississippi Valley. With lots of mixed layer Cape and healthy amounts of shear, the environment would be supportive of supercells and tornadoes. During the late afternoon, storm coverage was expected to become widespread across the moist sector, with several supercell clusters moving eastward from the mid-Mississippi Valley into the Ohio and Tennessee valleys. Steep mid-level lapse rates would promote large hail development. During the evening, the wind damage threat was expected to increase as the storms would transition into more linear structures, with multiple bow echoes expected to develop and produce extensive wind damage swaths. So, with the expectations covered, what did our numbers look like? Let's define our area of focus to be eastern Missouri through parts of eastern Kentucky. At the 500 millibar level, there was 60 to 70 knots of west-southwesterly flow, with instances of 80 knots of flow later on in the day. At the 850 millibar level, there was 35 to 45 knots of southwesterly flow. Effective bulk shear ranged from 60 to 70 knots, and effective storm relative helicity ranged from 200 to 300 meters squared per second squared. So we got a pretty sheared environment, all things considered. What about instability? Instability was also pretty high, all things considered. Mixed layer Cape ranged from 2,000 to 3,000 joules per kilogram across a good chunk of the warm sector, with areas in eastern Kentucky getting 1,000 to 2,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer Cape. Mid-level lapse rates ranged from 7 to 8.5 degrees Celsius per kilometer across most of the area, and 3 Cape ranged from 100 to 150 joules per kilogram. so there was a ton of instability. Now let's look at the soundings. There aren't a ton of observed soundings to cover because this outbreak happened in the one sector of the country without balloon soundings, even before the NOAA cuts. I want to discuss the Nashville sounding at 0Z. There is plenty of instability with nearly 2,900 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE, and mid-level lapse rates were high at 8.4 degrees Celsius per kilometer. Low-level shear was pretty okay here too, with decent curvature between the 0 and 2 kilometer levels. I once again want to give thanks to Jim Tang and Chaser Archive for letting me use the soundings on their website. Looking over the RAP profile soundings, there's a major issue in a ton of these, which is the lack of directional shear. Yeah, that wasn't really evident in many of these soundings. Everything else looked fine, but the lack of directional shear meant that supercell thunderstorms would likely need to have outside help in order to sustain themselves and produce strong tornadoes. Either that, or the RAP model soundings just underdid the low-level shear, or some combination of the two. Regardless, the Storm Prediction Center had been keeping an eye on the potential for severe weather from May 16th for a while too. On May 12th, the Storm Prediction Center issued a Day 5 15% risk for portions of Missouri, Arkansas, Illinois, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Throughout the following days, confidence would increase that severe weather would be possible in the region, resulting in a Day 2 moderate risk being issued for the risk of damaging winds, and that a 15% significant tornado contour was outlined at the first Day 1 outlook. At the 1630Z outlook, a 45% significant hail contour was introduced as well. Even with the forecast known, people had no idea how significant this day would end up becoming. Throughout the early morning hours of the 16th, a line of severe storms moved through portions of Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky, producing hail and strong winds as they moved through those states. Following those storms, clearing began to develop across portions of Kentucky and the states in the Mississippi River Valley, and the atmosphere began to rapidly recover. At 9 a.m., the SPC issued a mesoscale discussion for portions of far northeastern Oklahoma, southern Missouri, and northern Arkansas, monitoring the area for supercells to develop, especially as the cold front pushed east. Albeit, the coverage of severe weather was a bit unclear given how early it was in the day. By 11 a.m. Central, storms began to fire in northwestern Arkansas and southwestern Missouri, and those storms quickly became supercellular. Of those, the southernmost one in Missouri would be a focus for many people throughout the day. At 11:41 a.m., the SPC issued another mesoscale discussion, noting that storms were likely to rapidly develop over parts of central to southwest Missouri and northwestern Arkansas, with the developing damaging hail and tornado threat. With extreme instability developing, storms ahead of the cold front were likely to become supercells with time. At 11:55 a.m., a tornado watch was issued for portions of Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and Illinois. But north of this cluster, a supercell quickly formed and became severe. As it approached the St. Louis area, storms developed in the inflow region and merged with this cell. And the cell also began to interact with the warm front nearby. As it moved into the St. Louis Beltway, it quickly began tornadogenesis and it produced the costliest tornado of the day. Just a quick note before we get into this. Recently, NWS St. Louis said at a conference that they will be making major adjustments to this tornado's path and width. This video was made and researched before any of those changes were implemented, so any corrections and addendums will be in the pinned comment if those changes are made. Also, if you are enjoying the video so far, please consider subscribing. It helps me a lot and tells me I'm doing something right. Okay, enough shameless promo, back to the video. At 2:39 p.m. Central Daylight Time, a tornado touched down just outside of Clayton right next to I-170. Shortly after touching down, it produced an area of EF2 damage, but mostly produced EF0 to EF1 damage as it traversed to the east-southeast through Clayton. By 2:40 p.m., after crossing South Big Bend Boulevard, it began to take its turn to the northeast, all while widening out and producing widespread EF0 to EF1 damage to areas around Skinker de Bolivar and Forest Park. The twister strengthened as it hit multiple apartment buildings near de Bolivar Place at EF2 intensity, and then moved into the Fountain Park area where it began to produce EF3 damage to homes in a strip mall. It approached Greaterville at 2:44, and produced its last area of EF3 damage to a series of 4 homes, with peak winds of 152 miles per hour. The tornado weakened a bit as it crossed over I-70 before strengthening a little bit more crossing Hall Street, then weakening once more as it crossed the Mississippi River and moved into Illinois. At around 2:50, the twister crossed near Granite City, Illinois, and produced widespread EF0 to EF1 damage there as it continued to move to the northeast, soon hitting Pontoon Beach at around 2:59. Around 3 p.m., it crossed over I-270, and soon began to narrow and weaken, producing its last area of EF1 damage near the Sunset Hills Country Club, then lifting over the Stillwater Senior Living Center at 3:06 p.m. The St. Louis EF3 tornado was on the ground for 23.3 miles over the course of 27 minutes, with a peak width of around a mile wide and estimated peak winds of 152 miles per hour. The tornado injured 38, killed 4 with 1 additional non-tornadic death, and caused $1.6 billion in damages. The St. Louis supercell would soon dissipate, and focus shifted back south to the initial cluster, and at around 3:50 p.m., the southernmost supercell was about to produce its first tornado of the day. At 3:54 p.m., a tornado touched down just outside of Shawan, Missouri, initially producing minor damage as it traveled along State Highway Y. As it crossed State Highway DD, the twister intensified to EF2 strength, as it tore the roof off of a home, before it weakened for a little bit as it continued to move to the south of County Road 502 and County Road 464. At 4:02 p.m., the twister struck the southern side of the town of Crowder, Missouri at EF1 intensity, uprooting trees and destroying outbuildings. The twister moved over US Highway 61 at 4:05 p.m., and it rapidly intensified as it moved over Sloanville Drive, strengthening to EF3 intensity as it completely destroyed a mobile home and destroyed most of another home nearby with winds of 152 miles per hour, before weakening slightly as it moved through Sandy Woods at EF2 intensity. The twister took a dip to the south after passing through Sandy Woods, hitting homes off of County Highway 524 at EF2 intensity, then homes off of Woodhaven Street, before lifting at 4:15 p.m. after crossing State Highway O. The Sikeston-Blodgett, Missouri EF3 tornado was on the ground for 21 minutes, traveling a total of 16.35 miles with a peak width of 200 yards and peak winds of 152 miles per hour. The tornado injured 10, killed 2, and caused $15.2 million in damages. Meanwhile, further to the north, after the St. Louis supercell moved into Illinois, it quickly dissipated, although a messy storm mode continued in the area for a while after. But soon, another round of storms fired along the cold front. Despite the fact that storms had just moved through the area, the environment these new storms were going into was still primed for severe weather. Notably, a supercell that had formed in southeastern Missouri around 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time quickly got the attention of meteorologists as it progressed to the east. By 5:15 p.m., tornado warnings began being issued for the storms that approached the Missouri-Illinois border. As the supercell approached areas south of Marion, Illinois after 6 p.m., tornado genesis quickly occurred and it soon produced the strongest tornado of the day. At 6:15 p.m., a twister touched down on Grassy Road, traveling to the east and producing EF0 damage to trees up until it crossed Township Highway at 6:18, where it began to produce EF1 damage to trees and outbuildings. The twister began to rapidly intensify as it approached and hit housing near FCI Marion, a prison off of I-57, producing EF3 damage with winds of 165 miles per hour. After crossing I-57, it set its sights to the north of Hudgens, Illinois, destroying homes off of State Route 37 at 6:22 p.m. As the tornado approached a small neighborhood off of Quarterhouse Road and Andrew Road at 6:24 p.m., the twister produced EF3 and EF4 damage, removing the roofs off of homes in the best-case scenario, and destroying them in the worst-case scenario. At 12928 Kyler Court, the twister reached its peak intensity as it struck a two-story home built in 2003 with peak winds of 190 miles per hour. The house was no match, and was wiped off of its foundation. Hundreds of trees nearby were reduced to stubs. The twister weakened a bit as it continued to the east, but still remained intense as it crossed Ward's Mill Road at EF3 intensity, leveling homes and tearing others down to their interior walls before weakening to EF2 strength for a while, destroying outbuildings and heavily damaging homes, power poles, and trees on Moke School Road and Saline River Road. By 6:28 p.m., the twister intensified to EF3 strength once more as it crossed State Route 166, ripping apart the exterior walls of buildings on both sides of the highway. The tornado then began to deviate to the south, narrowing and weakening slowly before it lifted just north of Mossyville Road at 6:32 p.m. The Marion EF4 tornado was on the ground for 17 minutes, traveling a total of 16.28 miles with a peak width of 900 yards and peak estimated winds of 190 miles per hour. The tornado injured 7, killed none, and caused $25 million in damages. The supercell responsible for the Marion tornado would produce 2 additional twisters in Illinois, an EF1 near Somerset and an EF2 that hit near Gibsonia. But shortly after crossing into Kentucky, it produced its last tornado, an intense EF3 just outside of Morganfield. At 7:16 p.m., a twister touched down between State Route 2834 and Bunger Road, initially producing minor damage as it moved to the east, damaging and uprooting trees. Its weak nature continued up until it approached Field Road at State Route 130 at around 7:23, where it rapidly intensified to EF3 strength, tearing one house apart and ripping the roof off of another with estimated winds between 140 and 150 miles per hour. Traveling along Robinson Road, the damage was less extensive for a while, up until it approached US Highway 60, where it began to produce EF3 damage once more, ripping roofs off of homes and tearing others down to just a few walls, reaching its peak intensity with winds of 155 miles per hour. The twister's strength weakened for a little bit as it traveled to the north of Ed Ricketts Road, producing EF2 damage in the area up until it hit a home near Wildlife Road at around 7:27, producing EF3 damage to a home and removing its upper story. The tornado continued to produce EF2 damage as it crossed over State Route 56, then weakening as it traveled over open land before it reached EF2 intensity right before it lifted crossing Kit Harris Road, causing ground scouring in the area at 7:29. The Morganfield, Kentucky EF3 tornado was on the ground for 13 minutes and traveled a total of 9.93 miles, with a peak width of 500 yards and estimated peak winds of 155 miles per hour. The tornado injured 4, killed none, and caused $15.1 million in damages. After the Morganfield tornado lifted, the main supercell of concern was to the southeast. The supercell that had produced the Sikeston-Blodgett, Missouri EF3 was still ongoing in southern Kentucky. It had produced a few tornadoes since then, including an EF2 near Hopkinsville, but outside of that, nothing worthy of note came from it, up until it reached near Jamestown, Kentucky, where storms nearby were able to help the supercell get its act together, and soon it produced the deadliest tornado of the outbreak. At 10:26 Eastern, a tornado touched down over State Route 619, producing EF1 damage to structures and trees as it moved to the east-northeast. Damage remained minimal until it crossed State Route 76 around 10:33, where it began to destroy mobile homes and debark and down trees in the area as it continued on its path. As it crossed over Grosser Ridge Road shortly after, it reached EF3 strength as it destroyed the outer walls of homes and soon debarked trees off of Narrow Ridge Road. The twister weakened a bit as it crossed Charles Brown Road at around 10:39 p.m., but caused a small area of EF3 damage to a home off of Cook's Chapel Road at 1041. The Twister continued to the east, producing EF1 to EF2 damage as it crossed over State Route 196, Hominy Hill Road, Fawbrush North Fleet Road, and Highway 1664, then weakening to only produce EF1 damage as it crossed Robertsport Road at 1047. While the Twister up to this point had traveled through mostly rural terrain, it was now setting its sights for the southern part of Somerset, Kentucky. In preparation for this video, I spoke with Maidsuit, a fellow VTuber who lives in Somerset. He told me that the threat of severe weather that day was known by residents like himself, but none of them were expecting a full-blown tornado to come through that night. Were you aware of the threat of severe weather earlier in the day, and if so, what stood out about it?
Kind of, yes. We've got a lot of like notifications on our phones saying, "Hey, there's going to be severe weather," but there wasn't anything like take shelter now or anything like that. It was actually just kind of like, "Hey, watch out, the weather's going to be it's going to be pretty bad today." So, I worked that day and then I went home. And then I think around later in the day, it actually picked up and everyone's phones was like going off and it says seek shelter now, like the alert that everyone gets on their
Right.
phones. And yeah, at that point everyone was like sort of freaking out like, "Oh, this is serious." Except for my family. And my family was actually on the opposite end. They were like, "Ah, it'll probably be okay." Um And so, basically, when the tornado actually came, um, apparently it was a lot worse than we thought, because we could actually see the tornado from sort of my yard-ish area. We could see it in the distance, and it was kinda scary, and we were like, "Oh, shoot. Okay, everyone get in the bunker now," because, this apparently is way more serious than it was.
The Twister produced EF2 damage to a home off of Knoll Lane before entering the southern side of the city, producing EF2 damage to numerous structures as it trekked through the area. After crossing Regency Drive, the Twister intensified to EF3 strength as it hit a B training facility in southern Kentucky Rec at 1058. As it left Somerset, it produced EF3 damage to structures off of State Route 1247 and Jones Knob Road before producing EF2 damage for a while. The Twister produced its next area of EF3 damage off of State Route 769 to Metal Trust Towers at 1109. The tornado remained at EF2 strength as it crossed over mostly rural lands, hitting the community of Colo a few minutes after its most recent area of EF3 damage. As it approached State Route 3269, the Twister rapidly intensified, producing EF3 damage to trees, then EF4 damage to homes and trees off of the state route at around 11:16 p.m., with estimated winds of 170 miles per hour. It continued to the east-northeast, producing extensive and extreme damage to softwood trees, with winds higher than what the DoDs would allow for such devastation. But it was also becoming painfully apparent where the Twister was heading: the town of London, Kentucky. After a period of weakening, the Twister began to produce more damage to trees off of Afton Lane and Sarah Lane at around 11:37. But as it approached I-75, it began to rapidly intensify, producing EF3 damage to homes off of Lovelace Subdivision Road and Wine Road, then reaching EF4 strength once again as it crossed over into the Sunshine Hills subdivision, with winds of 170 miles per hour at 11:41 p.m. The Twister weakened a bit, but still produced intense damage as it crossed along Settlebrook Garden Homes Road, then over I-75 soon after. The destruction didn't stop, as it continued to produce significant and intense damage as it moved near the London Corbin Airport at 11:46. Causing even more intense damage before it crossed over State Route 1006 at 11:48, producing its last area of EF3 damage just off of that road. While the Twister was roaring just south of the airport, Security cameras there caught the twister in plain view, with debris swirling around it. The twister began to weaken, producing EF2 damage for a while to homes off of Fairgrounds Road and Cedar Ridge Road at around 1150. The tornado continued to become smaller and weaker, producing EF0 damage as it crossed State Route 521, State Route 830, State Route 80, and finally State Route 488. After crossing State Route 488, the twister had lifted, and its reign of terror over southeastern Kentucky was finally over. The Somerset, London, Kentucky EF4 tornado was on the ground for an hour and a half, traveling roughly 60 miles, having a peak width of about a mile wide, and containing estimated peak winds of 170 miles per hour. The tornado injured 108, killed 18 with 2 indirect deaths, and caused at least $350 million in damages. The Somerset, London EF4 was the deadliest and costliest tornado to hit the state of Kentucky since the Western Kentucky tornado of December 10, 2021. After the Somerset tornado lifted, the supercell would get absorbed into the line behind it as it traveled further through the Appalachian Mountains, thus marking the end of the tornado outbreak. However, there are a few tornadoes I didn't mention. Notably, there was a long-track supercell in Indiana which was responsible for 2 EF2 tornadoes, including one that was on the ground for quite some time. Additional tornadoes touched down in areas further east as well. In total, there were at least 29 tornadoes, 3 EF0s, 14 EF1s, 7 EF2s, 3 EF3s, and 2 EF4s. In terms of other severe weather threats, there were a plethora of wind and hail reports. In total, there were 843 wind reports, with 8 reports for winds in excess of 65 knots, and 383 hail reports, with 88 of them being for hail larger than 2 inches in diameter. The strongest non-tornadic wind gust reported was 83 miles per hour near Frankton, Indiana, and the largest hail size reported was 4.5 inches in diameter near La Center, Kentucky. There were also just strong winds in general with this system, which kicked up a ton of dust and led to multiple dust storm warnings for the Chicago metro. But come the following morning, all the focus was on the destruction left behind by the multiple twisters in Missouri, Illinois, and Kentucky. Damage from the St. Louis EF3 started off of I-170, relegated to trees that were snapped and minor damage to various buildings. The damage quickly became more intense over the Cavalier, where the majority of the roof covering and a portion of the roof decking was removed. Throughout Clayton, damage to homes was apparent, with shingles missing, broken windows, and minor tree damage. Throughout De Bolivar Place, there was damage everywhere, mainly to the roofs of buildings. The worst of the damage came from Fountain Park. Buildings off of Cates Avenue, North Kings Highway Boulevard, Cabane Avenue, and Albert Avenue were significantly damaged, from roof damage to upper story floors being utterly devastated. A residence off of Page Boulevard to the north was turned into nothing more than a pile of bricks, and the strip mall to the north was heavily damaged as well. Across Fountain Park in Greaterville, brick buildings had their walls collapsed. The next area of EF3 damage was around Greaterville along North Newstead Avenue. First was a home that had completely collapsed from the tornado. To the northeast was another home that suffered the same fate. The house right next door was destroyed and turned into a pile of debris. A few houses down from there was another home that was turned into a pile of bricks. EF2 damage continued for a while, with multiple brick walls that had fallen onto the ground and crumbled up due to the winds. No matter where you looked, there were bricks everywhere from the fallen walls. The last areas of EF2 damage was from broken power poles that were snapped off like they were toothpicks, and from a metal building where the roof purlins buckled. Across the western and northern sides of Granite City, trees were uprooted and toppled onto the ground. The snapped and uprooted trees continued as we went into Pontoon Beach, and near the end of its path at the Sunset Hills Country Club. The last area of damage noted from the Damage Assessment Toolkit was minor roof damage to a home off of University Drive. The first signs of damage from the Sykes and EF3 tornado came off of State Highway Y, where a tree had fallen onto a house. Tree trunks nearby had also fallen too. Off of State Highway DD was a house with its roof torn off by the tornado. Off of County Road 599 was a power pole that was leaning at an angle. Near Crowder, an outbuilding had collapsed and half a dozen trees were uprooted. Damage from the tornado was minimal after that up until it passed near Sloanville Drive. Outbuildings were destroyed, homes had their walls collapsed, and 2 mobile homes were obliterated. One of the deaths was at one of the mobile homes. Most of the brick houses nearby were destroyed too. A home at the intersection of Sloanville Drive and County Highway 405 was also in a bad spot. Mobile homes in Sandy Woods were completely destroyed and rolled away, and the first story of a home was blown away in the wind as well. At a home off of Lake Road where the exterior walls had collapsed, a family of 4 took shelter in the hallway. One elderly lady suffered a broken tailbone and other injuries. Another house nearby had been shifted off of its foundation, and the C&J Tree and Lawn Service building was also destroyed. A couple dozen trees were snapped or uprooted along County Road 524. Also off the road was a home that was mostly destroyed, alongside a large barn. 2 dogs and 2 horses died during the twister here. Damage near the end of its path was mostly relegated to trees. Similar to the other twisters, the Marion EF4's damage began relegated to trees off of Grassy Road. About 2.5 miles to the east, the tree damage became more obvious. Off of State Route 146, a mobile home sustained damage to its roof and some of its exterior walls. The damage truly became intense once you got to FCI Marion, a medium-security federal prison. The walls had collapsed on prison staff housing, and the NWS was not allowed to get any further due to security reasons. Nearby, off of I-57, there were several debarked and stubbed trees just west of the interstate. Large double wooden post transmission lines were snapped at the base too. Near Hudgens, homes were inaccessible, but all the walls had collapsed in one instance. But the damage truly became worse off of Quarterhouse Road, and a neighborhood just off of it. Outbuildings were leveled. Large sections of the roofs of homes were ripped off like it was nothing, and hundreds of trees were reduced to stubs. But the worst of the damage came off of Kyler Court. A 2-story home built in 2003 at 12928 Kyler Court was completely swept away with the slab cleared and debris scattered into the wooded area behind the home. The residents of the home were not present when the tornado struck. Damage analysis showed that everything above the floor diaphragm of the home was removed. The studs were toe-nailed, and there was evidence of partially engineered wood being removed. The combination of the extreme tree stubbing nearby, combined with the typical construction methods of the home, supported an estimated peak wind speed rating of 190 miles per hour. Extensive damage continued to the east of Wards Mill Road. One house had all of their walls collapsed and the house slid several feet. The walls were either nailed to the foundation or were positioned on concrete blocks. To the north, one home had its exterior walls gone, and another house had its entire roof ripped off. At 5838 Wards Mill Road, a single-story home with a concrete block foundation anchored with a few J-bolts to the exterior walls was destroyed. 3 occupants were inside the home when the twister struck. 2 rode out the tornado in a front loader with the bucket raised to deflect debris, while the 3rd occupant inside was thrown about 50 yards and suffered lacerations and a fractured cheekbone from flying debris. At 5958 Wards Mill Road, the entire house shifted off of its foundation by about 20 feet. The family who lived there got word of the tornado coming on their phones and they sheltered in their tornado safe room. But because the tornado had shifted the home off of its foundation, they were trapped for 2 hours. But thankfully they had no injuries. EF2 damage continued as you went further east. Evidence came from large sections of roofs of homes being removed, and the snapping of trees and power poles. The last area of intense damage came off of State Route 166, where a house with little anchoring was blown away. The home across the street was similarly destroyed, and the next home to the east had large sections of its roof removed. But the family inside was safe thanks to them taking cover in their anchored tornado shelter. The last area of damage noted was of large tree branches broken off of Mossyville Road. Damage from the Morganfield tornado began with ground scouring off of Bunger Road, and large tree branches that were snapped. Off of Blue Road, trees were uprooted. However, the damage quickly became more intense as you got off of State Route 130, Field Road, and Robinson Road. Dozens of trees were snapped. The house nearby was destroyed with the debris still visible from the house next to the foundation. The outbuilding next to the house had some of its walls collapsed and part of its roof ripped off. Just across the street was a brick building that had its roof torn off. The extent of the damage leveled off just a tad as it crossed through Robinson Road, up until it neared US Highway 60. Large sections of the roof and some of the upper story were thrown away by the wind. Across the highway at 1975 US Highway 60 West, a one-story brick home was mostly swept clear off of its foundation. The walls appeared to be nailed to the foundation. Off of Ed Ricketts Road and Tear Hill Road was a home that had appeared to have lost most of its exterior walls. You could clearly see what was inside of the home from the outside. Damage across Ed Ricketts Road was still significant, including an instance where the roof of a home was torn off and landed right next to the house. Off of Wildlife Road was a house where the top of it was ripped off and apparently some of the exterior walls had collapsed. But that's hard to say based on the photo and the damage assessment toolkit. A mobile home nearby was completely destroyed, and dozens of trees were snapped too. Right at the end of the tornado's path was extensive ground scouring in a field, including spots where corn was ripped right out of the ground. Damage from the Somerset London tornado started off relatively minor to small outbuildings and trees. The damage got worse near Whittle, where trees were debarked with only the stubs of the largest branches remaining off of State Highway 76. A manufactured home just to the north was destroyed. Off of Whittle Road was a manufactured home that was rolled off of its foundation, and the metal garage building behind the house was also completely destroyed, with numerous trees down nearby. The intense damage became apparent off of Gosser Ridge Road, where 2 homes were left badly damaged with only a few of their exterior and interior walls remaining. Off of Narrow Ridge Road were trees that were debarked with only the stubs of the largest branches remaining. A house off of Charles Brown Road had its roof missing, and large trees in the yard were torn apart by the twister. Then, just about half a mile to the east was a home on Cook's Chapel Road, where the house was heavily damaged, and the hardwood trees nearby were debarked with only the stubs of the largest branches remaining. Off Hominy Hill Road, an outbuilding was totally destroyed. Damage leveled off in intensity for a while, with the exception of a home on Oaks Road, but it quickly got more serious as you got closer to Somerset. Part of the roof of a home off of Knoll Lane was ripped off, and then you got into Somerset proper. Off of West Bourbon Road, 2 homes were destroyed with many trees snapped, and the garage and house across the street was damaged. Across the street was damage to the roof of a garage with the trees thrown across the neighboring field and hillside. Numerous trees were snapped, uprooted, and twisted on top of a hill off of Granell Court. The twister crossed over the hill and proceeded to produce significant damage to multiple houses and apartment buildings in a subdivision. Major damage was sustained to a small shopping center and a technology center building, hitting businesses such as the Hairbrained Salon. The Hardee's restaurant sustained significant damage, with all the windows blown out and the sign was busted and bent. 50% of the roof cover was lost at the South Central Bank. Baxter's Coffee took a direct hit to the front. The original gas station next to it lost its roof and 2 of its walls, but the cooler was still intact. At the Redeemer Lutheran Church, the back and front walls of one of the buildings was torn apart, and roof loss was observed on both of the buildings of the church. Power poles were snapped at the base, and the sign was blown out. A grove of trees behind the church were also snapped and twisted. Off of Southern School Road, multiple metal buildings sustained heavy damage. At AB Training Facility, a large portion of the roof and the second floor was missing, and substantial damage was done to the east-facing front. The rec building just across the street was hit hard too. A large amount of damage was done to the main office building. The warehouse building next to the main office was heavily damaged, with insulation littering the fences nearby. Softwood trees just to the east were also hit pretty badly. Multiple points of damage were observed to the east along a farm, including a small barn building that was slid off of its foundation, a silo that was destroyed, metal roofing removed from a building, and several vehicles that were possibly moved and knocked over. Maidsuit was one of the residents who was keeping a close eye on what was happening, and soon after the tornado found out about the devastation itself. He told me what he saw the day after in Somerset.
I started seeing stuff online after, like, that night, right? After the tornado had passed, people were like, okay, now we gotta assess the damage. Everyone was on like Facebook and Instagram and whatever my parents use and whatever my friends use. Everyone was on those social media platforms just looking up Somerset stuff and were like, oh, okay, this is pretty bad. And then the next morning, I think it was a weekend. Maybe not. Maybe it was the
It
middle
was
of
a
the week.
Friday
I
when the
it
tornado
was a
happened.
yeah. Okay, yeah, it was the weekend. So I got up the next day and I rode with my family. We just kind of all hopped in a car and went and took photos of all the damage, and that's where most of the photos of same day I sent you.
Right.
That's where most of those photos came from. It was just that same day where we just were like, "Oh shoot, what the heck?" And I messaged all my streamer friends, all my friends at businesses that I can't name. uh, yeah, they were all just like, "What the heck, bro?" So it was pretty wild.
Just generally, how did it impact those that you knew?
Um, Personally, my so I work as a MSP in person.
Right.
That's such a weird thing to say in real life. Yeah, no, I work as a MSP, so that's basically a tech agent for I do everything from IP cameras to network access to network stacks, firewalls, manage computers and stuff like that. And we do it for a bunch of companies. So if a company can't afford their own technician, they hire a MSP, and that's what we do. So I actually got a exclusive look into what it's like for businesses. Um, Lord Almighty, we were so busy. It was really bad. It was probably some of the worst times it's ever been. It impacted businesses definitely the worst, because that's pretty much where it cut through, like, sort of, like, the main industrial area, in Somerset here. Baxter's Coffee is one of them. I think, I mentioned that, uh, earlier in our messages.
Right.
That was one of the biggest ones that everyone was like, "What the heck?" Luckily, they have multiple locations, but yeah, no, they were just, like, flattened. The RECC was just that all the electricity was out for everyone for, like, a long time. No internet, of course. I mean, it impacted the community in a way that was, like, it kinda put in perspective of how fragile our city is, I guess.
After crossing State Route 1247, the tornado continued its destructive path. Multiple homes off of Curtis Ray Road and Jones Knob Road sustained substantial damage, mainly those in the direct path of the twister where walls looked to have collapsed. Trees were also snapped and uprooted. To the west, a junkyard had cars moved and trailers flipped. Significant damage continued to the east to homes off of Johns Knob Road and Elihu Cabin Hollow Road. Right next to State Route 769 laid large metal transmission line towers that were pulled out of the ground and thrown about 250 yards to the east while also being crumpled up. For a while, the majority of the damage was done to trees. It wasn't until it crossed State Route 3269 when the tornado became violent. A home and outbuildings were completely demolished, with the debris from the house blown eastward, while some of it collapsed into the basement. The cinder block garage was blown apart, and the woodshed and barn that sat on the rock foundation was demolished. A grove of trees to the northeast of the house were also debranched and debarked. The extensive tree damage continued as you went to the east. Interestingly, the NWS noted for multiple of these points of the damage assessment toolkit, winds likely higher than what degree of damage allows for softwood trees, possible EF4. Off of State Route 1003 was a single-family home that sustained considerable damage, with all but one exterior wall collapsed and the debris blown eastward. Multiple other homes in the area were also destroyed, including 2 mobile homes that were completely destroyed with the frames mangled. Extensive to violent tree damage persisted while the tornado continued to the east. Then it approached London. In a neighborhood just outside of town, homes suffered significant damage. Trees were broken and snapped, and the damage only seemed to get worse the further east you went. Off of Hartchurch Road was the next general area of EF2 damage, where homes were devastated. But off of Lovelace Subdivision Road was where the damage truly started to get more intense. One house on the road suffered from the loss of its roof, while the house across the street had its exterior walls collapsed onto the home itself. Houses off of Wyan Road were also in very bad shape. One house that wasn't anchored at all to the foundation was picked up and thrown across the road. And then it hit the Sunshine Hills subdivision. Absolute devastation. The EF4 damage started near 444 Sunshine Hill Road. A brick home only had a few interior walls left standing. The family inside did not survive. The house next door was left in bad shape too. A mobile home chassis was thrown into a Ford pickup truck to the south. A portion of the walkout basement was one of the few things that remained standing, and it was said that 11 to 14 people took shelter there. Both family cats were found alive behind a couch in the basement during the cleanup process 2 days after the twister. Right next door from that house was Sunshine Hill Baptist Church, where the only thing remaining was a section of the basement built into the hillside. A home across the street was completely destroyed, with debris thrown to the east and northeast. At 832 Sunshine Hill Road, all the walls had collapsed with only the cinder blocks of the basement and the base of the walls remaining. The debris either collapsed into the basement or was thrown in all different directions. The trees on the property were completely debarked with no branches left. Across from where the church was laid a tree that had twisted metal wrapped around it, along with a wrecked truck and a foundation slab behind it. The homes off of Walker Lane were destroyed with the exception of a few interior walls. In one house, the crawl space was still intact, while in another, the flooring still remained. Across the street at 163 Boone Trail, the foundation was wiped completely clean, with some remnants of the sill plate and anchor bolts still there. Loss of life was reported at this residence. Near 141 Boone Trail was a house that was completely moved off of its foundation. Of note was the curtains hanging on the inside of the house, but flowing on the outside. At 176 Boone Trail laid a home that was completely destroyed by the twister. 2 homes down was a house that was wiped clean of the crawlspace foundation. The resident of the home was in the hospital and had to have an amputation, but was thankfully alive. At 147 Sunshine Hill Road, the only thing that likely saved the house and its occupants was that the grove of trees behind it took the brunt of most of the debris coming in. The house next door was wiped off of its foundation. The slab of the porch was removed and shifted about 10 to 20 feet, and cracked in half with the cinder block foundation still intact. The sill plates were ripped off. The family that was inside was thrown with the house, thankfully surviving with only minimal injuries. Homes on Saddlebrook Garden Homes Road were severely damaged and left with only a few interior walls. The EF3 damage continued after the twister crossed over I-75. Homes off of Philpott Road were swept off of their foundation or heavily damaged. The same extensive damage applied to homes off of State Route 1006 and Airview Drive. Homes next to the London Corbin Airport were damaged beyond repair, with the homes being left with only a few interior walls at best. Metal buildings next to the airport were destroyed too. The last area of EF3 damage was observed off of US Highway 23. Significant damage continued for a while, both to homes and trees, with the significant damage ending off of Cedar Ridge Road, with an entire tree limb impaled into a house. The last area of damage was observed off of State Route 488, with small limbs from hardwood trees broken. There were other tornadoes I didn't mention that still caused significant damage. Outside of Linton, Indiana, homes had their roofs ripped off, and outbuildings were destroyed. Homes near Bloomington, Indiana suffered extensively from a long-track EF2 twister that moved to the south of town. But what I just described was just the damage. There were also the stories of those who survived. One man in St. Louis took shelter at his home when it collapsed onto him. He was rescued and was doing all right, all things considered. DeMarco Davidson and others were in the Centennial Church when the twister struck. Sadly, Patricia Pendleton died, while DeMarco and others survived. Their attempts to call 911 were pretty much useless as the line transferred them to the non-emergency line. Near Marion, Illinois, Matthew McComas hid with his wife and kids underneath their house. They came up to see it was completely destroyed. Chelsea Pacord was taking a shower when she got a phone alert that a tornado was coming. She looked outside and saw the twister heading straight for her. She ran into her neighbor's house and jumped in their storm shelter with seconds to spare. Both of their houses were destroyed by the twister, and they had to wait 2 hours to be taken out of the storm shelter after a wall fell on it. In Somerset, those at Somerset Cinemas 8 were watching movies when the twister struck. About 100 people were there. The theater manager, Joe Kosmai, and security got patrons into safe spots and nobody was hurt. In London, Jennifer Adams and her sons were blown out of their house as the structure blew away with the wind. They survived with minor bruises and scratches. Joshua Hammonds was working at the London Corbin Airport when the twister moved through. A friend saw him on security cam footage and told Joshua to get to shelter, which ultimately saved his life. Some of my fans also gave their testimony on what they experienced. Tyler B. Humphreys was in St. Louis just outside of Forest Park. They didn't hear any sirens as the tornado was ongoing. They were able to spot the funnel as it was descending into the Clayton area, and it took about 30 seconds to process what was going on before they got their brother-in-law and their 1-year-old. They got down the stairs and the power flickered twice before it went out, and then the pressure in the room started to change. Their ears started to pop and they took shelter in the second bathroom. Then the apartment had its roof ripped off. They were without power for 5 days and would lose power periodically for weeks afterward. Internet service was out for close to 2 weeks and cell service was spotty for 2 weeks as well. Practically all of RJ's family was impacted by the St. Louis tornado. Their sister, who was a bus driver and driving the number 90 Hampton bus, barely missed being hit by the tornado. making it out of Forest Park with 5 minutes to spare. It took her 3 hours to get back to the garage to drop the bus off because of the damage. RJ's niece was at a school near Kings Highway and Natural Bridge, but the school was locked down and was safe. Their uncle was also nearly hit by the tornado in the Ville. Their brother experienced damage because a tree hit the power lines behind the house he was in. The only person who was unaffected in their family was their mother, who was just west enough to not be in the path. It took RJ 6 hours to get in contact with their sister, and another day and a half to get in contact with their brother. Kyonko's husband was working at the YWCA on Garfield, and was right behind the Harlem Tap Room and the brothers' diner. The windows in the school cracked. He assumed he was going to die, so he lit a cigarette in the building. To quote Kyonko, "We were losing contracts anyway, so what were they gonna do, fire him?" However, their neighbor's roof got ripped off by the tornado. In Henderson County, Kentucky, Brandon Kitchens worked at a Walmart in the county when the storm that produced the Morganfield, Kentucky EF3 moved through. There wasn't a tornado, but her car did sustain damage from the shopping carts that were moving across the parking lot due to the strong winds. An anonymous source on Discord told me that they were woken up by a tornado warning from their phone, and they went downstairs to look at the TV. They rushed to the bathroom to take shelter as they felt a strong gust of wind. There were tons of uprooted trees with all their roots completely flipped over. Houses were caved inwards, and you could peek into the Sunshine Hills at a spot where the trees were parted. But there were those who didn't make it out alive. In total, 26 people died on May 16th due to the tornadoes. 18 of those were direct deaths from the Somerset London EF4 alone. But with all the damage and destruction around them, people got to work in responding to the disaster around them. From St. Louis to Marion, Illinois, to Somerset and London, Kentucky. Following the storms, Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear declared a state of emergency for areas impacted by the twisters in his state. Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe requested for a major disaster declaration to be issued for St. Louis following the tornado there as well. On May 23rd, a major disaster declaration was issued for Kentucky by President Donald Trump, with a major disaster declaration being issued for parts of Missouri on June 10th. Across the hardest hit areas, big charities such as the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and Operation Barbecue Relief came out to show support. However, there are a few specific stories I want to cover. After the St. Louis EF3 tornado moved through the city, a curfew was announced to deter looting and allow law enforcement and EMS to work as they needed to. The priority in St. Louis initially was to protect life and find those who may be trapped and get them to safety. Mayor Cara Spencer stated to the press, "The loss of life and the destruction is truly horrendous. Our city is grieving." She urged residents to stay off the roads to allow emergency crews to do their jobs. Fire Chief Dennis Jenkerson said that 17 specialized search teams were conducting door-to-door sweeps throughout the areas hit by the twister. Hospitals were also getting patients quickly. A spokesperson for the St. Louis Children's Hospital and Barnes Jewish Hospital stated that they had received over 60 patients in total due to the severe weather. Businesses such as Verizon and AT&T announced they would be offering unlimited talk and text data for customers affected by the tornadoes. AT&T specifically mobilized its disaster recovery teams and announced $50,000 in charitable donations. Verizon offered free charging stations for those without power. One of the big nonprofits to help out was Action St. Louis, run by Kayla Reed. Thousands showed up in the parking lot of the YMCA's O'Fallon Park Rec Complex in North St. Louis to help those who had been affected by the twister. Helping more than 5,000 residents, and volunteers had collected more than 17,280 pounds of food. In Marion, a curfew was put in place through the following Tuesday. The sheriff's office established checkpoints, patrolled, and stationed deputies in the affected areas. The Red Cross of Southern Illinois hosted a multi-agency resource center for those impacted, providing temporary shelter, social services, emergency supplies, senior support, and mental health services. According to the Red Cross director, Dawn Morris, she noticed how resilient the community was. The Little Nashville Cafe hosted the Pickin' Up the Pieces fundraiser, raising money for the Rotary Foundation in downtown Marion to help those who were impacted by the EF4 tornado. The United Way of South Central Illinois was also involved in helping coordinate relief efforts in response to the twister. In both Somerset and London, Kentucky, curfews were put in place after the twister struck. In Somerset, the day following the tornado, it was strangers and members of the community who were in full force helping to clear debris and help with the recovery process. Ann Cook, one of the owners of Baxter's Coffee, stated that she got multiple phone calls and text messages from people asking what they could do to help out with the situation. The Creek Church in Somerset was set up as a station for people to get supplies and hot meals, with the church providing 200 to 300 hot meals per day to tornado victims. Maid Suit told me what he and his community did following the disaster in Somerset.
But also put in perspective, like, how cool the community is, because we all just kind of came together and just, I mean, there were people constantly working on telephone poles, constantly working on the electricity, constantly helping each other out, other businesses out, helping Baxter's Coffee out. Of course, I have those connections, so I was able to help them out personally. It was pretty cool.
So, what major charities and businesses came out to support the Somerset area from what you know anyway?
Okay, charities, I don't actually know the names of the charities. I should have done my research. I don't actually know the names of the charities, but I do know quite a few businesses that sort of just stepped up, like local churches. I can name one specific one that I was involved with. It was the Oak Hill Baptist Church. We were helping the community out, handing out. We do like a food drive. We were handing out food. Uh, giving shelter to those who needed it. I know personally, um, a coworker, I'll just say a coworker, was actually part of a apartment complex that was dehomed. And one of the churches was able to help them out, give them a home while their house was literally ripped apart. Like they looked, you could look up and like see the stars through their ceiling. So it was crazy.
In London, the situation was similar. The local community came together to help bounce back from the tornado. The Faith Assembly of God Church was set up as a place for people to report missing loved ones, and was filled with people handing out food, clothing, and household supplies to those affected across the county. According to the anonymous source, the community came together to help with debris removal, and a small trailer park was built for survivors. However, it wasn't all pleasant. There were 2 incidents of looting, one at a donation spot for a trailer park in Laurel County, and another incident where exotic birds were stolen from Adventure Pets in London. The birds were thankfully found safe and returned to the business. It was the local communities who worked the hardest. But before I talk about what's happened since, there were a few controversies that I have to go over. It's been a while since I've had to do a segment solely dedicated to controversies, but here we are. With this tornado outbreak, there were 4 in particular. One related to the sirens not being sounded in St. Louis, another related to the 911 line, one related to a tornado emergency not being issued for the Somerset-London EF4, and another one related to NOAA staff cuts. Starting with the sirens, tornado sirens in St. Louis did not sound when the twister was ongoing. According to Mayor Spencer's office, Commissioner Sarah Russell was attending an off-site workshop when the tornado warning came in, which prevented sirens from being activated at the Emergency Management Agency's main building. A call was made to the fire department instead to activate it, not that it mattered since the button to activate the sirens didn't work at all. In response, Mayor Spencer signed an executive order to put the fire department in charge of activating the warning system, and Sarah Russell was put on administrative leave. As for the 911 line going to the non-emergency line, which I mentioned earlier, This shouldn't be a shock, as sad as that is to say. 911 lines were overloaded in the aftermath of the 2011 St. Louis EF4 tornado, and 911 in general is heavily underfunded. With that knowledge, while it doesn't make things okay, it's understandable as to how calls to 911 quickly derailed into sending people to the non-emergency line. Now let's talk about the Tor-E controversy, and that was pretty much only an issue if you were mostly online. During the life of the Somerset London EF4 tornado, a tornado emergency was never issued for it. Why? Well, based on what it takes for a tornado emergency to be issued, it can be inferred that the requirements were simply not met. Except based on comments on the DAT, VROT was over 70 knots at instances during this tornado. But there were other rumors thrown about as to why. Mainly a rumor that a meteorologist in charge is needed to sign off on a tornado emergency being issued, which NWS Jackson, Kentucky did not have at that time. The key word in that claim is that it is a rumor, and should be taken with a grain of salt. Another point of frustration was that the tornado warnings were not upgraded to PDS until the tornado had hit Somerset. Although the tornado warning was upgraded to be observed before the twister hit town. The more frustrating part of all of this was that how a minority of people went on to say that there was essentially blood on the NWS's hands for not issuing a tornado emergency, basically saying that one of the reasons why the death toll was high was because a Tor-E wasn't issued. In my opinion, I feel like that is a stretch based on what happened, if not just a tad bit hyperbolic. When I went to a convention the week after this outbreak happened, specifically MomoCon, there were two interesting conversations I had. While these should be considered anecdotal at best for what I want to argue, I still think they're worth bringing up. One was with a woman who lived near Huntsville who knew what the tornado warning types were, and was very clear that the last thing you want to see on your phone is a tornado emergency. The second conversation was when I was at a cosplay meetup with some people when the topic of tornadoes came up. One of the people there, Chugga Conroy, asked me as to whether a tornado warning meant that a tornado was on the ground or not. Then I had to explain the different types of warnings and what they meant. Those stories I mentioned, while not enough to make a concrete conclusion on the effectiveness of tornado warning types, I think does spark a general conversation about how the general public responds to a tornado warning versus a PDS warning versus a tornado emergency. One that I can't fully digest in this video. But I mention them to get you to think about this from a general public standpoint. Generally, I don't think the lack of a Tor-E was as important as some say it was when it comes to the death toll here. Why do I think this? A lot of the deaths in London were attributed to the elderly, including those who were taking safety precautions. Not to mention that the houses where the majority of the deaths occurred, they weren't exactly the best in terms of construction quality, or the houses were just swept off of their foundations entirely. Basically, in those instances, unless you weren't there or you were underground, you didn't have a good chance of surviving to begin with. I will add, based on testimony from survivors, people seemed to take the warning seriously. I also think that people could have been more receptive to tornado warnings in this area based on the history of tornadoes in this region. The last time that a tornado hit Laurel County, Kentucky was on March 2nd, 2012. A pretty major outbreak for eastern Kentucky. While I'm unsure about the false alarm rate here, it wouldn't surprise me if the 2012 tornado led to some people taking the warning for the 2025 tornado seriously. Overall, I don't think a tornado emergency being issued would have changed much. I mean, the tornado warning wasn't upgraded to PDS until the tornado had already hit Somerset and the death toll there was 0. But that doesn't mean that the NWS is absolved from all criticism here. While I don't think the issuance of a tornado emergency would have mattered much in the long run, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't have been issued. Based on radar imagery at the time, and putting myself in the shoes of the meteorologists here, I feel like a PDS warning could have been issued for Somerset and London earlier than it was issued. I say could have been because its radar presentation on velocity was very messy due to its location. And a tornado emergency should have been issued for London, Kentucky. I'm not sure how many direct images or videos that the NWS office got when the tornado was on the ground, but tornado emergencies have been issued for storms just based on radar appearances and damage reports that a tornado is on the ground, i.e. Noonan in 2021. On the other hand, and I'm trying my best to not sound like an ass here, when it comes to reacting to weather warnings when one has the ability to do so, there's also a level of personal responsibility that people have to take. Let me sum this all up in this way. Should a tornado emergency have been issued for London, Kentucky? Yes. Should the tornado warning have been upgraded to a PDS warning earlier? Also yes, but harder to say given the velocity couplet looking more messy before it went to Somerset proper due to how far away from the radar it was. And also, again, hindsight is 2020 here. Did the lack of a tornado emergency lead to more deaths? Based on the stories of residents who were taking action regardless of the fact that it wasn't a Tory, those who died, and specifically their age, the types of houses and their construction, especially those where fatalities occurred, I'm inclined to say that it didn't affect the death toll overall, but it's hard to say for certain. Most likely no. Really, the topic of how effective a PDS warning and tornado emergency is compared to your average tornado warning is probably big enough for a video on the topic as a whole. If I do a video on that, I'll probably go into more detail there. The other controversy from the Somerset London tornado came down to staffing at NWS Jackson, Kentucky. For those who didn't watch my hour-long video on what has been happening at NOAA last year, I'll give you the TLDR. Shortly before this outbreak, NWS Jackson, Kentucky was one of a select handful of offices that announced they wouldn't be doing 24/7 operations due to staff shortages. There were concerns that the office would not be able to aptly warn storms if crap hit the fan. Following an interview with the Washington Post, NWS meteorologists stated that the office was properly staffed for the event, mainly because of the knowledge that severe weather would be possible. This was further backed up by Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, who has been very vocal about his opposition to NWS cuts, stating that operations that night were not affected by staffing cuts. Now, what would have happened if the risk wasn't as well known? Well, that's a topic for another day, or rather, a past day since I talked about it in my NOAA video. With the controversies covered, it's about time to wrap this up. So let's answer that question I've posed time and time again. How are the hardest hit areas doing today? 1 year ago, on May 16th, 2025, at least 29 tornadoes touched down across the United States. The majority of them in Missouri, Illinois, and Kentucky. Of those, the most significant ones included an EF3 tornado that tore through parts of St. Louis, Missouri, which killed 4, injured 38, and caused $1.6 billion in damages. An EF3 tornado that tore through portions of Shawan, Crowder, and Blodgett, Missouri, which killed 2, injured 10, and caused $15.2 million in damages. An EF4 tornado that moved near Marion, Illinois, which injured 7 and caused $25 million in damages. An EF3 near Morganfield, Kentucky, which injured 4 and caused $15.1 million in damages. And lastly, a powerful EF4 twister that tore through the communities of Somerset and London, Kentucky, which killed 18 with 2 indirect deaths, injured 108, and caused at least $350 million in damages. It was the deadliest tornado outbreak of 2025. So nearly a year later, how are the hardest hit areas doing today? The cleanup and response to the St. Louis tornado continued throughout the following months. In June, Governor Kehoe signed a bill allowing for $100 million from the state to be allocated to tornado relief in St. Louis. Also that month, Mayor Spencer issued an executive order to waive 25% insurance holdback for tornado-damaged properties. On June 30th, officials in the city planned to lift the tornado curfew. In July, the city announced new tornado recovery programs. In August, it was announced that proceeds from the Evolution Festival would be going to benefit tornado victims, with a minimum donation of $100,000 being pledged. In September, FEMA pledged that they would fund the debris cleanup from the tornado. 6 months following the twister, only $4 million in RAM settlement funds was spent on storm recovery. In November, While some storm sirens were still not working, city officials pledged that upgrades were on the way. By January, none of the money allocated by the state had been spent on tornado relief yet. Recovery has been painfully slow, mainly in part due to issues in the back and forth between the city, the state, and the federal government. But it seems like work was expected to begin sometime in April. In Somerset, the 606 Strong concert was held to raise funds for those who were impacted by the tornado. Besides that, I cannot find much regarding what has happened since then. What I do know is that the Hot Rod Power Tour did go to Somerset last year despite the tornado occurring prior to the event. The Summer Nights cruise also still happened as planned. I talked with Maidsuit, who gave me some insight as to what has happened since then, and what the legacy of the tornado has been in Somerset. I forgot what that thing you told me that Somerset does every year. I know every year the Hot Rod Power Tour comes in town.
Yes, is that the Summer Nights Cruise? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, but the Hot Rod Power Tour, I can't get in contact with whoever took. Apparently, they recreated a movie scene of a car jumping through the fountain in downtown.
Oh my god!
They did
There's
that.
footage of that online.
Yeah, there's footage of that online. They did that this year, like about a month after the tornado happened.
Yep, we sure did. That's Somerset, Kentucky. Oh my god, I can't. We jumped to the Duca Hazard over the fountain. It was the coolest thing. I didn't get to go because I was working, but we watched it live. I know people who were involved in setting that up as well. I mean, it was it was so cool. They used a Dodge Charger, and it was just destroyed when it landed. It was horrible.
Yeah, but I saw that and I'm like, I think they're fine.
Yeah, we're mostly fine. I mean, we're a pretty tight knit city for the most part. Um, so everyone pretty much knows everyone here.
So I guess that begs the question of how has the town just fared since then, and what's the legacy of it generally as we approach the 1 year anniversary?
I'm gonna be honest. It's when I went out and got footage for this, it's recovered for the most part, but there's definitely scars of like where the damage was, and it's still fresh in all of our memories. Like we still talk about it like weekly, right? Like that's one of the biggest things that that's happened in this town, other than the fountain jumping. So it's definitely impacted us in a way where with my business that I work with, since I'm MSP, we can go to our clients and say, "Hey, remember that tornado? You need to be prepared for something like that happens." It's a good opportunity to educate businesses. It's a good it was a good opportunity to educate people. What are you going to do when the power goes out? It definitely made the reality of things of your a human's life is pretty fragile here, and it can happen to anyone. So it definitely put that into everyone's minds, and I think it also sort of brought the community a little bit tighter. Um, you know, People tend to get closer through things like that. So I um I personally think it definitely had like a negative impact on people's lives, but also sort of had a positive impact too. And I think we've mostly healed from it. Just, there's some things here and there that still have got to be cleaned up, but the government won't do that.
For London, in June, it was reported that an arcade in London, the Palace, was accepting donations and providing relief for families impacted by the twister. A month following the tornado, first responders to the tornado in London were honored for their heroic response. In July, the nonprofit London Kentucky Strong held a candlelight walk to honor those who died in the May tornado. In December, members of the Coreyton Church brought Christmas gifts to Wyan Pine Grove Elementary School, to families who were hit hard by the tornado. 9 months following the twister, it began being reported that families were starting to move into new homes after they had been destroyed by the tornado. However, the legacy of these twisters still lasts to this day. 1 year later, many are still struggling. It's the topic of the towns that were hit weekly. It has never left the minds of those who were hit the hardest. For some, the mental trauma caused by these twisters lasts to this day, and will likely last for a long time after too. 1 year later, the communities impacted, from St. Louis to Blodgett to Marion to Morganfield to Somerset and to London, they will never forget the destruction and the trauma these tornadoes caused in their communities. And it's definitely a tornado outbreak that I will not forget anytime soon. Special thanks to my proofreaders, those being Alto, Foxtrot, and Griff, Maidsuit for agreeing to an interview and providing me with plenty of footage and images from the aftermath and how Somerset is doing today, Peter Corman for letting me use his radar loops, Kai Jackson for the footage from March 14th, 2025 for the intro, Brandon Kitchens, Celton Henderon, Jack Kelly, Kylie Rose, Kyonko Hizara, Arfram WX, and Scott Weeks for providing me with footage and imagery relevant to the May 16th, 2025 tornado outbreak, Brandon Kitchens, Jamie Yeager, Kay, Kyonko Hizara, RJ, Tyler B. Humphreys, and the anonymous source for providing their testimony for what they experienced during this outbreak. And as always, special thanks to Celtic White for being the channel artist, Amberry for the VTuber model, Zinel, Crackleck, and Cyanide Blue for letting me use their music, and everyone for watching. It means a lot. I'm glad to announce that my next video project will be on the Greenfield, Iowa EF4 tornado from 2024. I know this has been anticipated for a while, but I feel like I can finally get around to covering it. I will also, assuming nothing stupid happens, will be out chasing for about a week or so in late May and early June. So if you see some kid with a jacket on with a 3DS, that'll be me. I'm glad that I'll be able to chase this year and hopefully meet some of you fellow weather nerds out there. It will also be my first time chasing, so this'll be a fun one. Expect a video on it too, by the way, if things go through. Special thanks to my patrons and YouTube members, those being Montpelier, Phoenix, and Queen Hyena at the Ulfi's Army tier, Altostradamus, Michelle, Techno Idioto, Tefu, and Warm Off the String at the Ulf Jr. tier, Bipolar Batty, Brian Hawley, Dante DMC, Ellen Bryn, Esri, Foskrew, Foxtrot, Fry JC, James Sullivan, Hannah Stormer, Kara Kasumi Burr, I hope I pronounced that right, King Shisa, Liz Swaff, Meats Beans Machines, Rama, Tirani Rialta, and Van Granny at the Ulf MIDI tier, and everyone listed at the Ulf supporter tier. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you wish to support me financially and get access to some behind the scenes stuff, including stock footage, interviews, and more, consider becoming a patron or becoming a YouTube member, although more perks will be for those on the Patreon. Anyways, that's all I got. If you like the video, consider subscribing to the channel, giving the video a like, commenting your thoughts, hyping the video, sharing it around, all that jazz. Also, consider following me on Twitter and Twitch and even joining my Discord server. All of that is in the description. That being said, I'm Alferia, you all stay safe, and I'll see you all soon.